X Trail is brought to you in part by Amaze. Come in and be amazed. We have what you need.
And hello again, and welcome to another program of X Trail. Three financial institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, and the Inter-American Development Bank, they've predicted growth for the Barbados economy. However, that growth could be derailed by natural disasters, the ongoing pandemic, debt issues and supply chain problems, and the attendant high costs. So what lies ahead for the Barbados economy, regardless of the political party that forms the government? My guests today are Dr. George Brathwaite. He's a part-time lecturer at the UWI and a political consultant. Professor Don Marshall, Professor of International Political Economy and Development Studies, and Professor Justin Robinson, Professor of Finance at UWI. We'll take a break. We'll be back in just a moment. And we're back on the X Trail. Our topic today, we're looking at the Barbados economy. The IDB is predicting approximately 10% growth, IMF and World Bank approximately 8.5%, and this is in line with the forecast from our own central bank of between 7 and 9%. So I want to hear from each of my guests their thoughts on the current state of the economy and these predictions. Professor Robinson, I'm going to start with you. You draw the short straw.
Oh dear, thanks. Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to engage you and your viewers. So the growth projections you outlined are in line with the Central Bank of Barbados predictions, where I serve as a director. And unless we experience the worst of those factors that you mentioned that could derail the growth, I would expect the Barbados economy to experience some robust growth for the 2021 year. However, we have to contextualize that growth against where we are coming from. So in 2020, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Barbados economy would have declined by 18%. So to get back to pre-COVID levels, we would need approximately 18% growth. So if we get 10 or 12, it would have been an excellent year, but it would still leave us behind where we started before COVID. So I think we need to interpret the growth predictions and the health of the economy in that context. I think it's extremely important for us to achieve this growth, because the longer we take to get back to, say, the pre-COVID levels, the greater the challenges for all other aspects of the economy. So that's sort of my opening remarks, please.
Okay, Professor Don Marshall.
Yes, in much the same vein, I would suggest that while the projections are what they are, with the Omicron variant more or less virulent, there is the sense in which one will be more uncertain than one will be confident, and that is to do with the fact that we don't know what impact this will have for the travel industry, what impact this will have for the tourism industry, and to a large extent, because of the nature of our economy, which is not a diversified economy, our reliance on tourism and allied services, including international business and so on, really hangs on, particularly the tourism bit, hangs on tourist travel and the confidence that can be derived from persons whose businesses are allied to that industry. So it's fingers crossed. We hope that the cases that are rising in Barbados will abate shortly. We hope. The good thing is that the death rate is not increased. And globally, we do hope that this variant and others that are marked by high contagion do not necessarily lead to a deleterious drop off in tourist travel, because if that happens, then it'll wipe out the projections, really.
Thank you for that, Professor Marshall. And Dr. Brathwaite.
Yes, just in the same vein as Professors Robinson and Marshall, I share the sentiments that while we are looking optimistic, there is the reality of that uncertainty in relation to the COVID-19 and the threat and the variants. Uh, I suspect that in these initial months, there will be likely some stop start in relation to our responses in relation to those things that are occurring. But thus far, we are seeing good optimism and good confidence being expressed in relation to tourism and Barbados. And I think that is why the governor of the central bank's reporting is really sends positive signals. The fact that with a good and robust tourism season and the projections are there and all things hold and there's no worst case scenario, we will do well.
The IMF there recently reviewed their extended arrangement with Barbados, and it's a 4-year program, the BERT program, and they talked about that Barbados was progressing well with the program. But what are the benchmarks used to make this assessment? So when you think of how many small and medium-sized businesses have gone under, employment was in high double-digit figures, and the pandemic is taking a toll on the tourist industry, what are the benchmarks that will allow them to say that Barbados is still progressing on the track that it set in 2018? I'll come back to you,
Yeah.
Professor
Wait,
Robinson.
Yeah, so I think in a way, the way you frame the question, in a way, you may have led into the answer for some of the debate in Barbados, where maybe if you differentiate between macro and microeconomic. So a lot of the benchmarks or the targets are of a macroeconomic nature. And the Barbados government, I think I would give them full marks for the execution program, have consistently met or exceeded pretty much all of the targets in the program, whether original or revised. So in terms of foreign exchange reserves, that's a major target. I think the government has met and exceeded those targets. One of the key benchmarks is the primary surplus to GDP. So in terms of primary surplus, that is government revenue less government expenditure, but not including debt payments. So if you take the government revenue and you subtract all of the expenditure except debt payments, you have the primary surplus. And the original target in the BIRD program was that that should be a surplus, not a deficit, of 6% of GDP. And the government would have met that consistently. And when COVID hit us, those targets, that target in particular was revised. The most recent was a deficit of 1%. So the government has met those targets. Also, there are targets in terms of government's use of central bank financing, which was seen as a major issue leading into the crisis. So a lot of those targets have in fact been met, also passing key pieces of legislation and so on. But in a way, those are macro targets, which so they are not really targets that speak to the issue that you spoke about, so to speak. They're more macroeconomic, broader benchmarks as distinct from microeconomic or sort of things that impact businesses and so on. Well, they impact them indirectly because the macroeconomic framework is an important aspect of business success. I mean, if you use a cricket analogy, is the wicket they have to bat on, but it doesn't speak directly to some of the metrics that are hinted to in your question.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, in the IMF's recent review, they also mentioned the reforms to state-owned enterprises, including strengthening oversight of these entities. What does that mean? And as we talk about state-owned enterprises, I know people start to get a little nervous because they think that they're going to be closing them down. I'm going to come to you first, Dr. Brathwaite, and then come to Professor Don Marshall.
Yes, I would think they're speaking about in terms of a lot of the transfers and these and how these are utilized and then put up there. One of the things is about stemming wastage and creating an atmosphere uh, to keep it in really simple terms, in terms of discipline, uh, fiscal fiscal and monetary discipline is inherent in the plans that we've organized, and in a very constructive way, the IMF actually has been working with Barbados in terms of what Barbados has advanced. So I see this as redundant to the good of us in terms of us creating that space and uh, to eliminate wastage, to eliminate the whole notion of lackadaisical or non-performing private sectors and get them more engaged, or certainly public-private enterprises. And yeah, it can only add to the boost in terms of confidence. Now, if things were, and that is one of the things that we realized that we had coming over for several years in Barbados, for more than 2 decades, a lot of duplication in terms of the services. And I think this is now for a matter of streamlining and getting those types of entities to consolidate their efforts in a way that is much more productive and eliminates that wastage that I mentioned.
Dr. Marshall, when you hear um, major financial lending institutions talking about reforming state-owned enterprises, I think a lot of people hark back to 2018, where we saw so many people were sent home in an effort to reform these state-owned enterprises. And there has been some talk circulating either on the campaign trail or on WhatsApp messages that there's these harsh measures coming from the IMF coming down the pipe immediately after the election. So let's look at that. Can we expect more layoffs? Can we expect different types of financial instruments put in place in order to be able to reform these state-owned enterprises?
Earlier, when Justin spoke about the achievement of those macroeconomic targets, uh, the how the, the question of how we got there involve a mixture of attempts to digitize business services. That's still an ongoing program. The government's gone a long way towards completing that, but that's still ongoing, digitizing government services. And there has been a number of attempts to streamline the operations of state-owned enterprises, although that's still unfinished work. And there's also been an attempt to reduce the size of government, and again, it remains as part and parcel of meeting the primary surplus target of 6%. That involved pain. There is no getting around that, and the pain came with layoffs. 1,500 persons were laid off. So it's one thing to pursue the primary target of 6%. We were about 5.5, approaching the 6% target when the COVID pandemic was declared, March 2020. So government would have done well in accordance with its own commitment through the BERT program and the targets that it set. I mean, I need to say though that these targets that are set are determined by the Barbados government in a negotiation with the fund. So it's not a case where the fund is telling Barbados what to do, but there is a governing paradigm or understanding, and that is that the attempt is to promote financial sector-led growth, and to do that through financial sector enhancement, which is all about facilitating the ease of business and bringing greater efficiency spend to the country's public finances. Ultimately, we can't get around the idea that there were tough measures to get to meeting that primary target, and that the demand is that we start as soon as possible. I say as soon as possible from the beginning of the next financial year, to begin to claw back the need, or rather move towards gaining a fiscal surplus. We are at the point, as Justin indicated, where we've been managing with a fiscal deficit of 1%. The fund would rather that we move, like, notwithstanding the pandemic is still around, move gradually back to getting back to the 6% and sustaining it. So you're talking really about a serious shift in how we understand the role that the state will play in facilitating welfare and in facilitating diversification of the economy, of which more I will say later.
Okay, thank you very much. We're
Yeah,
going to take a break. Go ahead. No, let me take this break, and then when we come
right.
back, you can finish up. We're going to take a quick break. Don't stay with us.
X Trail is brought to you in part by Amaze. Come in and be amazed. We have what you need.
You're watching X Trail. If you're just joining us, my guest today, Dr. George Brathwaite, a part-time lecturer at the UWI and a political consultant, Professor Don Marshall, the Professor of International Political Economy and Development Studies, and Professor Justine Robinson, a Professor of Finance at UB. And we're looking at the Barbados economy and what lies ahead for the country, regardless of who holds the reins of government. So just before we went to break, we were looking at the IMF talking about that some state-owned enterprises still need further reform. And Professor Robinson, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, just thanks again. So Barbados would have gone into the IMF program on October 1, 2018. Now, anchoring that program, at the center of that program, is that the country would get to a debt to GDP ratio of 60% by a certain date. Now, if I want to get if I want to get from St. Philip to Bridgetown in a certain time, then there's a certain speed I have to travel, things I have to do. So key to getting us to a 60% of debt to GDP, that 6% primary surplus is critical to getting there. I mean, that's where the number comes from. We need to be around 6% primary surplus for a period of time to get us to that target. Now, I think what you were referring to was the IMF Article 4, and I've had a lot of questions about that, and I guess I'm at UE. We are in the business of public education, so I think it could be useful to say, well, the IMF Article 4 is something separate and distinct from a program. As a member of the IMF, you agree to this, okay? You sign up. You agree to subject your economic and financial policies to the scrutiny of the international community. So one of the functions of the IMF is country surveillance, where every year an IMF team would visit the country to assess the economic and financial developments and discuss the country's economic and financial policies with the government and the central bank officials. And while they're doing that, they would meet with parliamentarians, business, labor, civil society, and they then present their findings to the board. Now, one of the comments that stood out in that most recent consultation published on December the 17th is called Article 4 because it's covered under Article 4 of the document of the articles that created the IMF. Was that right now we've been allowed to run a negative 1% primary surplus because of COVID. And the report stated that we were expected to get back towards a 6% surplus. And so from a 1% deficit to a 6% surplus by 2024-25, beginning the upcoming financial year. So that's a substantial correction. No, I think it can be useful to contextualize that before COVID, with the policies the government had in place, the austerity, if we want to call it, or the program, then we were achieving those targets. So the new measures we need and the extent of the new measures we need will depend quite heavily on where you started the program, how quickly the economy recovers to pre-COVID levels. Because a recovery, I think it's reasonable to assume if you had the economy pre-COVID achieving the 6% primary surplus, if you can get back to that pre-COVID level, you could probably achieve it with something or with similar measures. If, however, your growth is below pre-COVID, then it's reasonable to expect that you will need additional measures, which would be some mix of additional government revenue, cuts in government expenditures. And we are aware that the IMF has often focused on that item in our budget called transfers and subsidies, which is the money the government provides to UWI, SSA, well,
Hospital,
not so much SSA anymore, and a number of these
children.
entities. How quickly can you have reforms in those entities to reduce the size of the transfer that is required from them? I think is an important issue that will confront any new administration as we begin to move past the ease we were given in COVID and try to get back on the path of that 6% primary surplus, all towards the goal of that 60 debt to GDP by 2035.
Very,
But
very.
Joel, could I
Yes.
say something?
Go ahead.
And for raising this in the public domain, I have been accused of scaremongering. I think that sometimes because of the nature of the silly season, we forget that anything that's going to affect our fiscal conduct or budgetary governance does remain important. And if it is that the Article 4 consultation report of December 17th speaks to a return to the classroom, as it were, where we try to go back to where we were, then, as Justin is indicating, and as I had read, it means looking at where we are now and trying to bring about a fiscal correction that will involve some pain, some adjustment, some tough measures. And we've heard that phrase being bandied around a lot. Uh, so,
But you know,
my,
Don, I think
yeah,
what persons
go on, John.
were more carried away with, uh, sometimes it comes down to the choice of words because yes, there may be some there may be some likely to be some austerity, some corrective measures, but when we start using the fair word, that in
What's
itself
that?
produces the
What's the
negative.
fair
And
word?
we know that there was a lot of misinformation regarding how the IMF operates. That's why I was very happy that Professor Justin recognized and said to the public that the IMF really is working in conjunction with Barbados, not that they are monopolizing any decision making process to tell us what to do. So I think it is those types of things, and it's about perception. But Don, I do agree with you. It is a discourse that must be had.
Another discourse that must be had is one of government's bugbears, the age-old issue of pensions. Now, many of them, they weren't managed well, they are non-contributory, and the government has been paying, in some instances, not consistently. So considering our aging population, how will this issue be resolved? Consecutive administrations just can't continue to kick it down the road. And we keep hearing that there are issues within the NIS, etc. So how are we dealing with that? Professor Robinson, I'm going to come back to you because I know you used to sit on NIS's board.
Yeah, so pensions are an important issue, and I think there are two different issues. So there's been an age-old issue, as you mentioned, that pensions within the public sector itself are not funded in the way pensions are funding, and it's largely responsibility of government. And it is reasonable to expect some reform in that area as the public servants age, and that becomes a larger share of government expenditure. So that I think that's something we want to look out for as to what is the policy in terms of how the unfunded pension element for public servants will be addressed. The NIS issue, I think, is somewhat different. So our NIS scheme is a defined benefit scheme. So the government promises you a given pension, and it's a pay as you go scheme. So I think those two combinations, where it's a defined benefit and a pay as you go scheme, any fund like that will periodically need reform or it will run out of cash. So, so any country with a defined benefit scheme and a pay as you go scheme will have to confront pension reform periodically. It seems we are getting to a point where Barbados will have to confront it again. I think the last time we did it was in 2002, when we were facing a similar situation as we are facing now in 2002. And at that time, NIS contributions were increased and retirement periods were extended. In addition to the normal structural features of a defined benefit and a pay as you go scheme, I think we've had two additional challenges. One would be the extended period of negative to low growth in Barbados, which really impacts on the contributions that are paid into NIS. If the economy is depressed, then wages, salaries, incomes, and contributions would fall below what was forecasted. We've had that aging of the population and retirement, which increases your expenditures. And as part of the debt restructuring exercise of 2018, the NIS did take some losses. So I think we can expect some recapitalization and refunding, a sort of reform towards the NIS. And I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yes, you have, but I would also like to hear. We're out of time for that segment, but let me take a break, and when I come back, Professor Marshall and Dr. Brathwaite, I'll come back to you to also get your thoughts on pensions and some recapitalizing of the NIS. We'll take a break. We'll be back in just a moment.
X-Trail is brought to you in part by Amaze. Come in and be amazed. We have what you need.
And we're back. Just before we went to break, Professor Robinson, we were talking a little bit about looking at the pension, the government pension scheme, and how it needs to be reformed. I believe Dr. Brathwaite, you and Professor Marshall wanted to jump in. Let's get that quickly, and then we'll go to our segment. The people say this is where we go look at the comments and questions that come from our audience. So, Dr. Brathwaite, I'll come to you.
Okay, I would like to endorse what Professor Robinson has been saying and making the distinction between the two types of pensions. Uh, but given the overall context, and certainly in terms of uh, how the average Barbadian sees it, they see the possibility that there could be some disruption. Uh, However, they may be calmed by the idea that this is a discussion that has been ongoing for the past few years, certainly in terms of pre BLP, in terms of really needing more and younger persons to contribute to the workforce. And if they're not making babies in Barbados, certainly you have to be bringing in persons. If you attach that to the things that you hear the governor of the central bank speaking, and the prime minister herself has said in terms of the projects that will come on stream, and I think they're also listed in the BLP's manifesto, you have several projects that will attract many workers. This is local, and we will also have to bring in some. And these are opportunities to really reboost, which will help in terms of the very recapitalization of the fund. So from that angle, I am not worried. Concerned, yes, but I don't think there's need to be worried. In terms of the fear factor, again, in relation to public servants, I think that there's some threat. The reality is that it is reasonable to make adjustments, particularly at this time where more persons are able to share in the burden. Government has been carrying that pension fund for a while. And if there is some minimal contribution that workers themselves will make to that, I think it can only do good for the overall of the country as opposed to looking at it in a narrow vein.
Okay, Dr. Marshall?
Yeah, so I would just want to add a slightly different angle, even as I agree with the general gist of what has been said. Sometimes I think we need to be a little bit more rounded in how we view what's happening. Right, when there's talk about pension reform, we should be aware of the universe of ideas around providing pension benefits. And Justin is right when he speaks about the difference between, say, a public defined benefit pension scheme versus a private defined contribution one, where where you make the contribution on the market, or among, or you shop around for as it were your own pension uh, scheme through an insurance company or similar, and so on, and you make your contribution. Remember that the fund would be saying to us that in their view, there's a need for the growth in the society and economy for an appetite to spread your your reliance, not necessarily on a public defined benefit scheme, that the one that we have established um, over 40 years ago, the NIS scheme. But they will be saying to us that we should be encouraging uh, many publics, many public workers and private workers to look towards um, securing private pension schemes.
You remember a
So the
little while ago
environment where
we were talking about retired RRS, retired um, saving schemes and stuff, and did those did Barbadians
well,
take
we'll be
up
trying to
those?
encourage. I, I'm not sure what I
I
know
would
that
say yes, that many Barbadians, a fair number of Barbadians did take
pick up
those
the
up. I think unfortunately people did take some sizable losses because of the debt
that's where
restructuring,
we're going.
because a lot
That's
of
where we're
those
going.
had been so heavily invested in government paper. And I think the nation today is reporting a study from one of the young economists at the central bank showing that many Barbadians are not adequately prepared and lack the financial education in terms of preparing for retirement. I mean, I think that's a major public policy issue. That's something I am looking for from the political directorate and other key players in terms of providing that financial education. I mean, one of the things I found interesting coming from the DLP platform is that they were saying they were going to allow persons a foreign exchange allowance of up to 100,000 a year to invest and trade. And I think as we move into this new environment, I think we do need, I think as George is saying, for the citizens to maybe do a little more in terms of their own financial planning and preparing for retirement, and just seeking to build wealth through investing. So I think that's one of the issues that I am looking to see how we can incentivize people to actually do more of that.
Okay, let's go quickly to our People Say segment. We've just got one comment from our audience today, so we're going to go to that, and then I will throw it out to the panel and get some response. Although I like the direction of the manifesto produced by the Barbados Labour Party, unfortunately I only see more taxes in our future and higher levels of unemployment from whichever party is in or regains power, which will lead to decreased spending. Gentlemen, your thoughts?
All of that is contingent on the rate of recovery. We were speaking at the top of the program about uh, hoping that the travel industry remains robust, and we were speaking about the fact that in the immediate environment, we need to have a robust rebounding of tourism to begin, and associated construction and so on, to see the uh, unemployment decline, and confidence return, as well as growth. We should recall that unemployment insurance is also coming to an end. A number of persons that were laid off and so on, and that have been receiving unemployment benefits and so on, may now be coming to an end. So we really would hope that the months ahead are not marked by a new wave that might force the issue, if not of um, lockdown, will force the issue of a cessation of tourist travel to our shores. We really hope that that's not the scenario we are going to be facing the next, say, 90 days.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Marshall. We're going to take another quick break, but when we come back, final segment, we look at just a couple more issues that will be facing the new government, whoever makes up that administration, with the Barbados economy. Stay with us.
X-Trail is brought to you in part by Amaze. Come in and be amazed. We have what you need.
In our final segment of X Trail, in looking back at the Barbados Labour Party's manifesto, it is very future thinking. But one of the things it talked about that really caught my interest was a lot of transformation. But in order to have transformation, you need to make it easier for people to do business. And doing business is a constant complaint from both locals and people looking to invest in Barbados. We're always hearing of people, of different methods being put in place to make it easier to do business, but yet it is still difficult to set up a company in Barbados. So I'm going to go back to my panel and find out from them their thoughts on what changes need to be made in order to make it easier to do business, to invest, to set up a company. So, something that in most countries you can do in a couple of days, but in Barbados is a weeks-long affair.
Can we jump in there,
just to
Joe?
jump in there, before anything
Right.
specific, I think your question again is pointing to what I see as an important overarching issue, particularly coming off the question that was posed in the chat there that we saw. So we are in an IMF program, maybe exiting, maybe not, but we are also very focused on what the rating agencies say and so on. And underlying all of that is that the role of government, so IMF programs and the rating agencies to some extent, there is an overarching philosophy which, as it relates to the role of government, that the role of government is to facilitate private sector led growth. So in terms of answering the question that person posed about unemployment, more taxes, whether or not that happened, whether we meet the IMF targets or not, whether we get more downgrades or upgrades, will depend on the ability to unleash private sector led growth in Barbados, because the reality is that the government's fiscal space is relatively limited, which goes to your role, where in such an environment, the burden then becomes on the state to have a regulatory environment that facilitates private sector led growth. And given the structure we are in, that has to be the focus of government policy going forward. How do governments facilitate private sector led growth? I mean, we could debate the specifics,
Yeah, I want to
but I
debate
think
it. Definitely.
right. No, no.
I,
And I'm saying, and we can
I want to
debate
debate that.
whether we should be going down that path or not. I mean, and there's scope for
Yes.
debate around that. But the path we are on
Mm-hmm.
is one where we, in a way, have committed ourselves to facilitating private sector led growth. Now, if you have that private sector led growth, which then generates a growing economy of a certain size, then the state has more revenues that the state can then do more things. But given where we are now and what we've committed ourselves to, we really have committed ourselves to having an economy that is largely led by private sector growth. And maybe it's just a reality of the amount of financial space that the government had. And in a sense, manifestos, public debate, and others, if they are operating with that within that framework, we should be saying, well, how are you going to facilitate private sector led growth? Because in a way, we are operating within a fiscal box. And maybe while I have the floor, I don't want to abuse it, Joel.
I, but I really am
But,
eager to jump in here. I really
but
am
for
eager here.
me, one of the things I want to say, one of the most important and for me pleasing developments of this election campaign is that both of the two major political parties in Barbados have committed to having a fiscal responsibility law or fiscal responsibility framework. I think is one of the most significant developments in modern Barbados that the two major political parties have committed themselves to having a fiscal responsibility law, which is effectively saying that government policy in terms of revenue expenditure will operate within a fiscal framework. And I think that's an extremely
There,
important and positive development. You know, elections are a funny thing. Popularity contests are, you don't know who might win or not might win or might
Justin,
lose.
can I come
But
in,
I think it's
please?
important, but whoever wins has to govern. And for me, it's a positive development that both parties have committed themselves
To
to
this piece of
operating
legislation.
within a fiscal responsibility framework that will be legislated. So I find that one of the most significant developments of this campaign and in terms of Barbados' modern economic history.
In the few minutes we have left, Professor Marshall, I'm going to
Oh
come
my
back to you because
God.
I know you want to jump in there.
I'm hearing you talking about the few minutes you have left. A lot has been said there just now that at the start of the program, before the viewers could hear, we were speaking about debates under the particular tree at Cave Hill, right? So this is one of those moments where I'm sorry that we can't have that robust exchange. I'm sure George will agree with me because there are some notions there being put forward about fiscal responsibility and so on, and these are heavily loaded terms. And notions of private sector led growth that is also very controversial because in other disciplines, I'm not in the same discipline as so I have different disciplinary lens when I look at this. Um, Barbados has a different historical, indeed, the Anglophone Caribbean, we have different historical and institutional starting points. We when we speak of private sector and try to batten that concept down for real meaning in the Caribbean, we see that there are a few wealthy elites that some of them or most of them are not necessarily immersed or oriented towards production and enterprise deepening value added than the rest of it. And that this is why the state has always had to join in an alliance with the private sector to escort, cajole, persuade them to move in required productive endeavors, move towards productive endeavors. So when we say private sector, who exactly are we talking about? When we say private sector-led growth, we got to come off of ideology and recognize that the state has to play a catalyzing, even as it is expected to play a regulatory role in bringing about the transformation that's required. It clearly is tension-filled and conflict-ridden to be expecting that the private sector will be the main engine of growth in our parts when as it stands right now, the very industry that is the most thriving and robust is a paradigm example of when the state enjoins the private sector. What happens? And that is tourism. So the role of the BTMI in its marketing and so on and expenditure, there's a successful tourism industry, if you could put that in inverted commas, largely to do with not necessarily private sector led growth, anything. It has a lot to do with the role that the state is playing in facilitating the hoteliers and other players in growing and finding out this industry. There was even a point we were paying for airlift to have tourists bus to our shores. But I'm going to leave it there for now, except to say this. A lot of what the IMF, a lot of what the BERT program is about does commode with the understanding that is like thinking and seeing like the IMF, and that's fine. But just understand that there are other alternative paradigms and ideas out there. You don't get a robust industrial policy while pursuing fiscal surpluses. That doesn't work. And this notion, this simplistic notion that of running a fiscal deficit is bad, running a fiscal surplus is good, uh, this used to be old style debates going on among dueling economists. That doesn't obtain anymore. And certainly I'll end with this. All the core advanced industrialized countries in the world are in this moment and beyond the pandemic, they will continue to run fiscal deficits. Um, this insistence that we, with a monocrop, monotype, undiversified economies, must be running a surplus of 6% and still expect to get a diversified economy with quality jobs as an output. That's a sad assumption. But I'll yield once
Indeed,
again.
Don.
I'll yield.
Don, uh,
Yeah.
I think one of the I understand and I concur with some of these things that you're saying, but I think you can extrapolate and go a bit further by contextualizing, particularly looking at the manifesto that is out, where I see something a significant change there in terms of mindset, innovation, the capacity now for citizen ownership, citizen utilization to play into the national um, grid in terms of energy and stuff. And these themselves become investments, forms of collateral. So I think there is a psychological shift being taken place that will really feed into having the private sector have more energy and more momentum in doing taking on initiatives that are useful for the overall benefit of the country. So that is definitely one of the positives that I see within the context of the Barbados Labour Party's manifesto. And I think it has to be highlighted because that in of itself represents a significant transformation, and certainly it should help in terms of reshaping how we perceive the private sector, and even taking into your context that there are the alternatives. It helps at least in terms of becoming innovative and not always looking to follow the old traditional path, but really look to root and reroute your paths in terms of your development.
Gentlemen, we are out of time. Each person has 30 seconds for final thoughts. This should be fun. 30 seconds, final thoughts before we wrap up. Professor Robinson, I start with you. Poor you, you've gone the short straw all through this program. 30 seconds.
One of the major developments of this election campaign is the fact that the two major political parties have committed to a legislated fiscal responsibility framework. I think this is a important and a positive development and can go a long way towards having macroeconomic stability in Barbados, whichever of these two political parties are in power, because the macroeconomic framework constitutes the wicket on which the economy plays. And having a stable and solid wicket, I think, will go a long way to allowing us to achieve our socio-economic development goals.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Brathwaite?
Yes, I will just end by saying that certainly discipline and responsibility will be two important words playing out in the governance of this country for this certainly for the next 5 years. I am hopeful that things would not get worse in relation to COVID, and the rebound that we are already seeing in tourism will continue and will be robust and will allow any government, whichever government gets now, the 20th, to have the type of space and be able to earn the types of revenues that can really get a lot of these investments going, particularly the projects in tourism and get our agricultural sector and all the various sectors going. The economy really has to be moving. It has to be moving, and we have to be earning. We have to earn our way. And again, it's responsibility and discipline that will help us to earn our way through in this
Thank,
transformation.
thank you very much. And Professor Marshall, you get the last word.
Yes, I really do hope that as a people we can also settle what constitutes sound fiscal conduct, what sound fiscal responsibility. These terms, fiscal responsibility and discipline, are very loaded, and it comes down to fiscal normality norms that align with what the fund would wish to see. And if statecraft is going to be about the pursuit of some degree of industrial deepening, some degree of uh, uh, manufacturing and value-added emphases, I think we have to move, statecraft has to be move beyond just simply demonstrating fiscal discipline and move towards developmental um, pursuits and initiatives. And you have to marry the two. And that may not necessarily mean that you are running surpluses as high as 6%. And it may not necessarily mean that you are trying to shoot towards debt to GDP of 60%. These are some targets and some norms around fiscal responsibility and good debt management that do not really hold for many advanced countries in the world today.
Professor Marshall, thank you so much, gentlemen. It has been a pleasure. Today on X-Trail, we looked at the Barbados economy. My guest, Dr. George Brathwaite, a part-time lecturer at UWI and a political consultant. Professor Don Marshall, a professor of international political economy and development studies. And Professor Justin Robinson, professor of finance at the UWI. Now, just before we go, we've been partnering over this period with Kev Politics, and they've done an unscientific Twitter poll, and we'll put it up for you. Do you intend to vote in the January 19th general election? Well, 54% they've said yes, 25% they've said no, and 21% they are unsure. So I want to say thanks very much to Kev Politics for that Twitter opinion poll, and they also have a discussion coming up. It's called Polyspace. It's a last lap weekend double header with the leader of the Democratic Labour Party, Verla de Pisa, and the leader of the Prime Minister of the Barbados Labour Party, Mia Amor Motley, on Saturday the 15th and on Sunday the 16th, so please don't forget it. Don't forget, you can also send your comments or questions to us at 228-5562. That's our WhatsApp number, 228-5562. Send us your comments and your queries. I'm Jewel Forde. See you next time on X-Trail.
X-Trail is brought to you in part by Amaze. Come in and be amazed. We have what you need.